Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our event today. We have the lovely Vanessa and Penny joining us. We are hosting, so if you're not familiar with us, we are Sterning Group. I am a specialist HR recruiter and I have known these ladies for a very long time through association with HR directors, different organisations, and Vanessa and I actually had the privilege of going to school together, so that was nice.
long time ago, yeah.
Yeah, just a few years ago.
Yeah.
So Sterning Group are dedicated recruiters. As I mentioned, I do HR recruitment, but we also have finance, administration, engineering, IT, and design. I work alongside very closely with Bianca Clifton, and as I said, we recruit across all HR positions. Penny and Vanessa run an organisation called the Learning Circle. Now, recently, they actually partnered with Diversity Dimensions, and Diversity Dimensions are Australia's leading provider of D&I solutions. So Vanessa and Penny are professional learning, organisational development and diversity and inclusion consultants, and they're very dedicated to enhancing business culture and achieving sustainable growth by aligning people with the values, strategy and individuality of the organisation. And they're actually just very nice people. So diversity matters, as we know. So the events of 2020 have really called on leaders to truly embrace inclusive ways of working, whether they like it or not. So some of these people, even when they're starting jobs, have never met these people before because we've been remote. So people have been able to, and I think what's happened over this time, and especially as a HR recruiter, talking to people, it's been a very big challenge. Just going straight to that flex piece. So working from home, preparing the organisation. But this is a presentation around how we embrace that flexibility, but then how we move it into the future. So a lot of people have been showing up as their whole self, and there's a very blurred line now between work and home. So flexibility is much more than just working from home. It's really important that there's a lot of trust when it comes to flexibility, but then also this is about making flexibility work for everybody. So people, customers, business, productivity, etc., etc. So the Penny and Vanessa, I was going to say the girls, I'm sorry, the ladies, today are going to talk about how you manage that flexibility now and into the future. So just a little bit of housekeeping first. Down the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat box and also a Q&A box. Enter any questions you like in there. We'll field them throughout and we'll make sure that your questions are answered. If we can't answer them during the session, we'll get to some question time at the end, but otherwise we'll try and answer your questions by getting in touch with you. So now I will hand it over to Vanessa and Penny.
Thank you. Thanks, Em. Thanks for that lovely introduction. And Penny and I are absolutely thrilled to be here today. So thank you for inviting us to talk about what is really a massive topic for HR practitioners and leaders and really anyone at the moment. We'll talk in a little bit about what a year it's been and who would have ever have thought that we would have found ourselves in the situation that we do now. But we are thrilled to be here and to share what we're seeing and what we anticipate seeing around the world of flexibility in the future. A little bit of introduction. My name is Vanessa Panay. I am the director and founder of the Learning Circle. I started that business 11 years ago this month, actually, and we work across the whole spectrum of learning and organisational development with clients that are big, small and medium across lots of different industries. I think some of you may have heard in our banter before, I've got my steel cut boots on today because I'm on a construction site running some sessions and doing some coaching here today. For us, talking now and having diversity and inclusion as part of our portfolio of offerings just seems really natural for us. We have recently partnered, as Em said, with an organisation that we have been working with through a consultancy arrangement for the last 6 years called Diversity Dimensions. And so what we're really excited about doing is partnering with our existing clients to support them in their diversity and inclusion needs and potentially growing partnerships with new clients in this space as well. Emma, you were going to kill me for saying this, but it's Emma's birthday today, everyone. So happy birthday, Emma. I had to get that in somewhere before we started.
Thank you.
So in conversation with me today, I've got Penny. I'll get Penny to quickly introduce herself in a second. Penny and I have worked together at the Learning Circle for 2.5 years. And prior to joining me at the Learning Circle, Penny was in a dedicated D&I role. So Penny, over to you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Vanessa. As Vanessa mentioned, I'm Penny Dimitro, and I have a particular passion around diversity and inclusion. And, you know, I think whilst 2020 has thrown so many challenges out to everybody, what's been really exciting is just how people have embraced true flexibility. And I always said that it would take a generation for us to change our views around flexibility. And lo and behold, it wasn't a generation. In fact, unfortunately, it was a pandemic. But I'm really excited to talk about, you know, the future of flex today and really give you some practical strategies for how you might implement them in your business.
Awesome. Thanks, Penny. And Penny and I's style is really casual and relaxed. So we're really just going to have a conversation and share with you what some of those strategies are. And as Em said, we'd love for you to contribute in the Q&A box, in the chat box, and we'll stop along the way and answer those questions as we go. So let's get started. Penny, I think you've kind of already said this in your intro. I think we've all said this. What a year it's been.
Yeah, definitely, Vanessa. I think when I think back to New Year's Eve 2019, as we're about to ring in the new decade, like who honestly would have thought we would be where we are today, in our living rooms for the majority of the year, working from home, working from wherever, our kitchen tables. And, you know, regardless of where you are and where you stand, 2020 has definitely had an impact on people. And if we think about this for organizations, you know, I think whilst it's thrown out so many ways of looking at this new normal, I guess the biggest one for many organizations has been that shift to remote working or working from home. And when we think about the future of work, you know, there's no denying that it is flexible, and it's flexible in its approach. And when we think about flexibility, what I want to talk to today is that it is going to look and feel so very different for every organization. When we think about how far we've come though in 2020, you know, it's been said that in 5 weeks, we made the equivalent of 5 years worth of progress. And whether it be looking at it from an individual lens, a leadership lens, an organizational lens, we want to look at, you know, what people are saying in terms of what's really going on in terms of flexibility, what the research is saying in terms of what's happening in the world of flexibility, and talking about some really key strategies that businesses can be thinking about and implementing to really future-proof flexibility within their organizations.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting the way that you talk about that you know it just kind of happened, right? And so we saw many organizations literally in 24 hours say, pack up your laptops, go home, we'll see you in 2021. Do you think that that's it? So, you know, especially for organizations that had never done this before, they've now sent their people home. And by the way, we aren't only going to be talking about flexibility in the frame of people working at home. We'll address that a little bit later on. But do you think we're done? So we've now kind of sent everyone home. People are working flexibly at home. Are we now done? Or do you think that we as HR practitioners, as leaders, as organizations still need to be refining what we're doing and thinking about how that flexibility continues to work as we move into the future?
Yeah, look, that is a great question. And I think to answer your question, are we done? Absolutely not. I think when, you know, the pandemic first hit, I think people put in, you know, some immediate strategies to cope. How do we first and foremost keep people safe? And a lot of that was to send people home with their laptops and start working from home. And I think as the months have progressed, as things have, changed, you know, from week to week, from month to month, organizations have made decisions based on what they think is best for their people, for their customers, for their key stakeholders. But do we need to keep thinking about the future? Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what we want to try and do today, is to share some strategies that are going to help prepare you for the future in terms of flex for your business. And, you know, when we look at what the research is saying and what our clients are saying, there were really 5 strategies that came to mind for us. And that is firstly, really understanding what is the current state of play. So regardless of what, kind of you put in place when the pandemic first hit or where you're currently at now, really understanding, what's happening for your organization, understanding, what does flexibility mean for your business? Because as I said earlier, it's not a one size fits all model. When we talk about, people in the corporate sector versus in, perhaps the construction sector, what their idea and their envisionment of flexibility looks completely different and feels completely different. So we're going to talk about how do we take an organizational lens and understand what flexibility means? What does it mean for our leaders? What does it mean for our people? And then what does it mean for the people that are supporting flexibility, the HR practitioners in the room?
So before, Penny, we get into the detail of those strategies, I think you use this term as well, and we're seeing this term used so much, the new normal. Can you share with the group, what does that actually mean? What is the new normal? And what is the data and the stats and the research showing us?
Absolutely. Look, the new normal, it seems to be a term that's been bandied around just as much as pivoting has been bandied around in 2020, the year of the pivot. In terms of the research, this research comes from the Flex Careers Flex Report 2020. And in terms of what we're seeing, I think there is no doubt that COVID-19 has really accelerated some fundamental change and long overdue changes around the way that we work. While we never would have chosen to experience a pandemic, it has given us a once in a career opportunity to really curate the best parts of flexibility and what's going to work for our organizations. When we looked at the research, what it was saying was that pre-COVID, there was less than 20% of an organization was working in some sort of flexible capacity, versus now organizations are saying that, 68% of their people are working in some sort of flexible capacity. What was interesting to me when we went through and looked at this research is what participants or what people were saying they wanted to, the days that they wanted to return to the office. And what is interesting to see is that people are saying when they return to the office full time, they only want that to be 1 to 2 days face-to-face in the office. And I think for me as an HR practitioner and those on the webinar today, it is really thinking about, well, how do we drive culture? How do we drive collaboration when it may be that, our typical 9 to 5 days a week is going to look and feel really, really different in the future?
So we would love to hear from the participants on the webinar today. Em's going to launch a poll in a second. We'd love to see where your organisation is at in terms of this flexible journey. So what you'll see is there's a poll that's just come up, and we'd love for you to put your vote in. Where is your organisation currently on your flex journey? So let's wait for those results to come in and see how we go.
And this is great. And I think, when we looked at Flex, I think it's very easy to fall into a comparison trap. And I know when I was working in a D&I role and I was running the Flex project for the particular organisation I was working at, it was a time when Telstra had just rolled out all roles flex. And I remember having a number of conversations with key stakeholders in that business saying, you know what, if we were to turn around and say that every role in the organisation is flexible, it was never going to work. And I think what we need to be thinking about is what's right for the individual, what's right for the organisation. Okay, I love some of the results coming in from this poll. So, I guess if we're looking at what's coming through in terms of those votes, 58% of people are saying we're making progress, which is fantastic. And I think it's something that we're always going to be working towards. I'd love to hear from the two responses that said their best practice. And, I'm hoping that you can share some of your best practice initiatives as well. There's people that are just starting out, people that are doing well, but the majority of us on today's session are really, have got some things in place. So hopefully this is a way to really, focus in on what's going to have the biggest impact on your roles.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks, Em.
And Penny, if I can just add something before we go on to the next slide, you know, as everybody was voting for this, I was actually thinking whether the results of this may be changing over time for people, right? So had we asked people at the beginning, they potentially would have had a different view. If we asked people in the middle, if we ask people now, I also think that the way that people vote often depends on where they are in the process. And we'll talk a little bit later on about, you know, what the Gallup engagement results that have recently come out over the last month are showing us globally about employee engagement and how that is affecting our view on flex and how well it's working. So should we go to the next slide, Penny? And do you want to kick us off with talking about strategy 1?
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Vanessa. So when we looked at our first strategy 1 is all around, as an organizational, you know, from an organizational lens, understanding what is the current state of play. And no doubt in everyone's mind, that new normal is going to look and feel different, whether it's staggered start times, whether it's flexible days, whether it's job share arrangements. It really is going to look and feel different for every organization. And there is no one way to do flex. And I think what COVID has really shown us is that flexible working isn't just working from home or having a job share arrangement or being part-time. There is so many different ways to work flex, and it is going to be very unique to the business and to the individual. So in terms of our first strategy, it really is using, I guess, a really practical tool that Vanessa and I use with a number of our clients, and that is looking at that SWOT analysis to really understand, you know, what is going on for the organisation. And perhaps you may look at a SWOT in terms of, well, what kind of strategies you have put in place at the start of COVID and what's in place now. So really drawing out, well, what are the strengths here? What's gone really well for us? What are some of the positives? How have we changed our ways of working that have been for the better of our organisation? Maybe there was some really stale and old approaches to flexibility that weren't working, that we've had to really pivot and change on, that are going to be for the better. What are the weaknesses? So where have people struggled? What challenges are leaders facing? You know, and I think in terms of a weakness, what we're seeing a lot come out in terms of this new way of working is that people are feeling very fatigued. You know, they're getting fatigued from being at home. They're getting fatigued from being on Zoom meetings. So, you know, is there an operating model that needs to shift in terms of how we work flexibly? What are the opportunities? So what can we capitalize on? You know, what does that hybrid culture look like? And if we are going to only be in the office 1 to 2 days a week, what does culture look like? How are you going to drive engagement? Because again, the research has shown us that at the start of COVID, engagement levels were really high. And now what we're actually seeing is that engagement levels are plummeting and probably at their lowest point that we have seen them. Vanessa, I know that you did do some research around that for another client. Would you like to share about engagement?
Yeah, it was really interesting research, actually. So we're actually running some care for the carer sessions for a number of HR teams. And part of that is talking about what engagement currently looks like. And the latest data that's come out from Gallup says that when the pandemic first hit and people were sent home to work, engagement was at a really high level. People certainly felt stretched and felt like they were establishing boundaries, but engagement levels were actually quite high. What they found now, and this is the latest data that's come out over the last 4 to 6 weeks, is that engagement levels, and this is globally are at an all-time low, and it's the fastest they've dropped. They said it's the fastest they've dropped even compared to the GFC and when 9/11 hit. So it's definitely an interesting thing for HR practitioners to be thinking about around if engagement is now at an all-time low, and obviously it depends on your organizations, you know, what are the things that we need to be thinking about when it comes to engagement and culture and of course flex as well. Yeah,
absolutely. Perfect.
So strategy 1, Penny, that you've just taken the group through is about that individual thinking about what currently is going on in our organisation in terms of flex, where are things working and where are there opportunities to do more. The next strategy is about the first thing you actually go and do with the business, or some of those steps that you can take to actually talking to your stakeholders in the business business about this. So can you take us through what some of those ideas are?
Yeah, sure. So when we think about strategy too, that is really looking at that macro level and understanding, what the future of flexibility means for your organization. And more than that, understanding what is the current experience and barriers to flex in your organization, and then really defining out what your flex narrative is. Because, and I'll keep banging on about this, it's going to look and feel different for every organization. Now, it goes without saying that flex is good for business. It's a long been accepted that it's key for driving business outcomes. It's good for retaining talent, for engagement, fundamentally, people are at their best when they have that agency to choose how and when they work, okay? But when we think about flex, it isn't a one-size-fits-all model. So we need to understand, in your organization, what is that sponsorship and what is that advocacy for flex? And a practical strategy to really understand that at your organizational level is to complete, what we would recommend is to complete a series of diagnostics. So starting at that exec level, what is that sponsorship for flex? Who are the advocates in your business who really identify and role model flex? Were they role modeling flex before the pandemic, or have you had some real epiphany or aha moments, now that they are working from home and they've realized, wow, that people can work from home and be productive, and get their job done? And I think what has been really interesting for me, sort of sitting back and watching this all unfold, is that there were so many leaders that had this really strongly held belief that if they weren't in the office, then how can I really trust that they were getting their work done? And they've actually been able to experience, I guess, the other side of it. And they can see that, you don't need to be limited to an office to be able to be productive and to be able to have an output. So I think really looking and identifying those sponsors in your business. Then it is at an executive level, understanding what their appetite and need for flex is, and really, seeing where the champions for flex are in your business. And what we've seen when we do this particular diagnostic is that there can sometimes be, I guess, a real distinction between what an executive says is happening and then what is also happening on the ground at an operational level. And you get that operational view from really understanding from your leaders, what are the barriers to flex? Are there particular roles that just can't be worked flexibly? So how do you set that role up for success? Are there different ways of structuring how that person works so that there is some degree of flexibility? And then at an employee or frontline level, what is their experience? Are they experiencing, a leader that just doesn't believe in flexibility, therefore they're not getting flexibility? Or are they experiencing a leader that really embraces it and so they've got that flexibility? And what you want to try and, create is that consistency of experience across your entire organization. And you do that through your comms plan. So building that awareness and advocacy for flex, finding people that are happy to share their flex story and their flex journey. And when we look at, I guess, building that comms plan, you want to be your own PR agency, right? You want to say, this is what we offer and this is how we do it. But finding, I guess, more of that left of center people that are going to share their experience. We've all heard from the mother who works flexibly because she got the young kids. Okay, that's the common flex story. You want to share, I guess, something a little bit different. Where's the professional athlete by night that's, the corporate worker by day? Or perhaps they're caring for elderly parents or a disabled, they've got disabled carers responsibilities. How can you share those stories so that you're normalizing flex? And you're getting a view across the organization so that regardless of who's looking at that campaign, they're saying, you know what, I identify with that message. That can be me. And that's what I want in the role that I take.
I love all of those messages that you've shared, Penny, especially that, a couple of things really resonated with me. First of all, the leader who was always so opposed to flex before and now has had no choice but to be put in a situation where they have to manage in that environment. And we have seen in our clients so many of those leaders that now say, yeah, I was wrong. People can work from home. And I think the trust piece is an essential piece there. Also, the thing that resonated with me secondly was what you just shared at the end, that when we talk about flex, often what we hear about is the working mum, but there are so many other examples of where flex can take place and where those opportunities are available to others. Before we move on to the next slide, which is one of the favorite things that we like to talk about, I just want to say for the audience that is listening, certainly the style that Penny and I take are to be really practical and pragmatic in the things that we share with you. And so what we don't want today to do is to overwhelm you and to think, oh my gosh, I've got 6 different things that I need to implement. How do I do all of that? What we really want you to think about are the things that are most critical for your organization. And as we're taking you through each of these different strategies, to really be evaluating and assessing your organization in terms of what you've got and what are the gaps. And then in terms of the gaps, what are those gaps that you really need to hit and address immediately, and then in the longer term. So let's move on to the next strategy, Penny, which is talking about our leaders. What we find, we do lots of work in the leadership space, and we are finding that right now, leaders are being asked to do more than they ever have. So they are being asked to support people's mental health, their physical health, their performance health. As Em said in her intro, they are really having to take on that whole person. It's not enough just for leaders to say, oh, I'm only going to worry about what you're doing 9 to 5. We are now supporting leaders to support their people in this work from home environment. So what is the next strategy in terms of how we can support our leaders?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Vanessa. So for us, strategy 3 is really understanding what support you will provide to your leaders to really help them lead flexibly. And, you know, if I can kind of just talk to pre-COVID, I guess what happened and what happened for a number of organizations and leaders within those organizations is that flexibility was really given or afforded to those that fell within the legislation requirements. So those that were able to have the right to request, so that they had caring responsibilities, they had, you know, children they had disability responsibilities, they had, you know, some sort of caring for elderly parents, those sorts of things. And so if you didn't fall within those parameters, often the easiest thing for leaders to do was to say, well, unfortunately, you can't have that flexibility. And what the pandemic has shown us is that regardless of your personal circumstance, your professional circumstance, everybody wants some sort of flexibility in how they work. Not everybody wants to work from home, but everybody wants to have that agency for how they choose when and how they work. And so when we think about how we support leaders, it's providing, I guess, the skills and the confidence and the knowledge to be able to unify a team regardless of where they are. So you may have 5 of your team working from home and 3 in the office. You may have, you know, 2 that perhaps never come into the office. How do you build culture? How do you collaborate? How do you unify a team when you may not all be in that physical one space together? And when we look at the support that we want to, or I guess the opportunity for those on the call today, is really looking at a 2-pronged approach. How do you provide education to leaders, and how do you provide support to leaders? So when we look at the education piece, for me, educating leaders is really elevating that discussion. So not just thinking about the one-on-one discussion around flex. I know that Vanessa needs flexibility to pick up her children from to pick up her children from school. But how do we think about the conversation as a whole team? So if you've got 10 people in your team, how do you know and are across all of the arrangements that everybody wants to have, or the flex needs of everyone, so that it not just works for the individual, it not just works for the team, but it works for the organization, it works for the customers, it works for your stakeholders. And that is really, I guess, the piece that we need to elevate the capability of our leaders to have, to be able to not just manage those those flexible arrangements, but be able to have those conversations. And for some leaders, it's going to be having tough conversations to say, you know what, this flex arrangement's in place, but it's not working. I need you to come back into the office, or I need you to start working, you know, these set hours, or I need you to be available to take calls at this particular time. And what has happened in the absence of of giving leaders these tools is that they haven't had the conversations. And what happens is these arrangements once worked for an individual or for them or the team, and now we're seeing them turn into arrangements that aren't working, that maybe you've inherited that flex arrangement as a new leader, or maybe they've been let go so much that we're actually coming into like a performance issue. So what we want to do for our leaders is to provide them with the tools to be able to understand how to manage a flex arrangement, how to claw it back if it's not working, and how to really establish that rhythm within the team so that it's working for everyone. And we do that through education. We also do that through support. So really having practical resources, handbooks, toolkits to be able to support, that process internally so that they're managing that flex arrangement so that it works for everybody.
I think this is such a critical piece, Penny, and certainly one of the things that we hear on the ground in organisations who may have really sophisticated and open flex policy arrangements is that it often comes down to what the leader says, right? So the organisation may say, we support flex, and if it works for you, then talk to your manager about it. But if a leader doesn't inherently believe that flex can work, often it doesn't matter what an organisation thinks. So for me, that leader education and support piece is really critical.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. And, to that point, I'd love to do another poll. I'd love to understand, from those on the webinar today, how would you describe the current commitment from your leaders around flex? Are they still skeptical of flex? Are they sitting on the fence, or do you have some strong advocacy for flex?
Penny, while we're waiting for that to come in, one of the participants today posted something that I think you addressed. I'm putting you on the spot now, but just talked about it a little bit then around how the legislation, had quite a narrow scope for who could work flexibly. And one of the panelists said that, organisations are now far ahead of that scope when it comes to their policy. Any kind of comments around that?
Look, I definitely agree. I think the legislation was in place to really support organisations when, excuse my French, when shit hit the fan. They were, I guess, to protect the employee and the employer. I no doubt think that the legislation will change post-COVID. It has to. There is no doubt about it that it is behind the times. But I think organisations, and particularly HR practitioners on the call, need to be working in partnership with your employee relations team to make sure that when you are creating your flex policies, when you're creating your flex processes, you've got a fair and just process that you can demonstrate if things were to go sour, that you have given the employee the reasonable opportunity to have flex, that you've given your leaders the tools and the resources to lead and manage this process. And what we're going to get onto in our fourth strategy is around making sure that your employees, that your people have the resources to be able to manage their flex arrangement as well.
Yeah, 100%. It's interesting to see the way that the polling is going, that 53% are still saying leaders are still sitting on the fence, and without understanding, obviously, the reasons why. My opinion would be is that you've still got a lot of leaders sitting on the fence because managing flexibly, it potentially is far more challenging for them in this current environment than it has been before. And so I think part of that education and support piece is also helping leaders not just to know how to establish flex arrangements and have flex conversations, but also how do they lead a team that is flexible and working remotely? What does their manager operating rhythm look like? How often do they have to speak to people? How do they manage performance and behavioural issues when they've got a whole team of people working in their own home? So I'm wondering whether, and from my perspective, I think maybe it's they're sitting on the fence because it is quite challenging. I mean, one leader we had in one of our leadership programs was telling us that they had an employee who was in his early 20s, was living in a share house, so had one bedroom as his space, didn't have a desk, of course, and was sitting on the floor in his bedroom with his laptop on a milk crate. and this guy was working in his bedroom, sleeping in his bedroom, eating in his bedroom. And so that leader was trying to manage the motivation levels, performance levels, health levels, mental health levels of this employee in that state. So it is definitely a challenging environment for leaders to be managing in at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, this is, again, we can't underestimate how unique this situation is. I think, you know, regardless of where your organization sat pre-COVID, you know, I'm sure there has been so much pressure on the HR practitioners on this call to have a response to flex and have a response for how we manage people working from home. So, you know, I think when you're doing this reflection and you're doing this analysis of where your organization's at, you also need to kind of be a bit kind to yourself as well, because I think we're all dealing with this in the best way possible. And, you know, when we look at what we're providing today, I feel like it's strategies that can future-proof. So you might do one of these 5 things today to kind of get you that little bit further. You don't necessarily need to tackle all of them. And if your leaders are still sitting on the fence around flex, I mean, I can totally appreciate where they're coming from, because they are being asked to lead in a way that is so different to any other, you know, time in history. You know, there is so much being asked of them that, you know, if the flex piece, they haven't really quite gotten there yet, you know, we can still give them some time to get there.
Yeah. Em, I might stop at this point and go to you. Anything you want to add here? Any sentiments that you want to share that's come out in either the chat box or Q&A?
I think there is a question, but one comment I have, I think that, you know, this mental health piece for leaders is so important. A lot of the managers we talk to are feeling overwhelmed or burnt out, or finding that they're doing more hours than ever, and no one's taking leave.
Yeah.
No one's taking leave. So sometimes, like,
wants to take leave to just stay at home.
Yeah, exactly. So the mental health and the communication is really important. But one question we did get was around this. So, so our leaders were on board. So this is a statement question. Our leaders were on board, but now are raising concerns about effective communication and culture. We have 50 locations across Australia, so we're always going to work somewhat remotely of each other. So the leaders who are raising this have not had given clear examples to provide. So how would you recommend we turn this conversation back to the positive?
Yeah, okay. Look, I mean, I can jump in first if you like, Penny. I think, you know, what I picked up on there is the culture and communication piece, which I think a lot of organisations are now talking about. And for me, the answer to that is less necessarily about the leader education piece narrowly around the flex, and more about the leader education piece in how do they still create an environment where the culture is maintained and communications can still be at a maximum. So for me, to address that question, it's more about what leader education and support you need to provide in terms of helping leaders to manage in this current environment.
Yeah, it's so tough.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
One foot in front of the other.
Yeah, and I think a similar sentiment came through in the chat box as well, just around, you know, it's about how they proactively manage it going forward, and the remote working and the flex working going forward.
Yeah. So they were saying that leaders are feeling comfortable with individual level conversations. Yeah. So it's in general, it's working, but not feeling confident about how proactively they're managing it. So maybe that reactive piece.
Okay, Penny, anything else you want to add here before we move on to the next strategy?
No, I think just circling back to the mental health piece, because I think that's going to come up a lot for all organisations. I think it's really, you know, and you may use this strategy as part of your comms strategy, that, you know, the flexibility, now people have that inherent flexibility to work from home. Flexibility, and what comes under that umbrella of flex, is taking things like purchasing additional annual leave and, you know, structuring like a condensed working week, things like that. So really perhaps tying in that mental health strategy with your flex strategy and saying, you know what, here are some examples of leaders that are working a compressed working week, if that works for the role in the organization. Here are some leaders who are purchasing additional annual leave because they need a break and they need some time out. So, you know, maybe piggybacking off, you know, your campaigning around flex, but also maybe nicely marrying in that mental health component, because I think what both of you have shared is absolutely right. Well, why would I have a holiday if I'm just going to sit in my home? But it is so critical to everybody's mental performance, physical health, that we are having a break.
Okay, I think that's a great conversation that we've just had. If I can just, as we're talking, I thought more about that question that came in, Emma, and I had a reread of it. You know, the question there is, how do we turn this conversation back to positive? I actually think that it's about really diagnosing what's going on, right? So maybe the first step isn't to turn it back into a positive conversation. Maybe the first step is to diagnose what is actually going on here and address that in order to turn it back to the positive. Yeah, so I think there's probably an opportunity for that participant to think about, you know, what's that underlying thing that's
happening. Absolutely.
Okay, so our next piece, and I find this one really interesting, one of the things that we certainly always bang on about when we talk about flex, or have talked about it in the past, is that flex was a two-way street. And I think one of the things that a lot of organisations tend to forget when they talk about flex is, how do we provide information, education and support to actual employees in terms of how they put forward a flex arrangement, how they work best when they're working flex, how they make it work so that the people around them say, yeah, this is a good arrangement, and it's not having an impact on the rest of the team or on the deliverables. So Penny, do you want to talk about the next strategy, which is around how we can support employees?
Yeah, sure. And I think you're right, Vanessa, like when we look at what organizations are doing, you know, there is a lot of support for the leader. So how to manage a flex arrangement, how to, you know, implement it, how to work remote, etc. What we are often or what's often left scrambling is the employee. And, you know, it's that typical scenario of where they know they want some flexibility. So they start Googling or they start searching through their intranet pages, and they're finding, you know, old examples of how to apply for a flex arrangement. And what we have seen, and I'll keep saying this, is that regardless of professional or personal circumstance, everybody wants some flexibility. And part of the education for employees is actually educating them on what flex is. So it isn't just the part-time, it isn't just work from home, it isn't just job share. It is a whole heap of different things. And when you know from, you know, an organizational perspective what you do offer, you know, putting that out there for everyone to see so that there is that choice when it comes to knowing what kind of flex is available to them. And again, part of the employee strategy is being quite two-pronged. So there's an education component, there's a support component. And when we look at the education for employees, part of it is giving them the how-to for actually coming up with a business case. They have to have some commercial nous about them. They can't just, you know, say that they need flexibility and it's a very emotive discussion that they're having with their leader. And I always think back again to you know, the working parent scenario, but, you know, it's the new returning mother returning back from maternity leave. She knows she's locked in 2 days of daycare on a Wednesday and a Thursday. And so she, you know, fronts up to her manager and says, okay, well, I can come back to work 2 days. It's Wednesday, Thursday. And the leader with their commercial hat on thinks, well, that's not going to work for me. That's not going to work for the business. That's not going to work for our customers. You know, no, you can't have that flexibility. What we need to be helping our employees do is to think from a commercial standpoint, what is the flex that I want, but what is the flex that's going to work for my stakeholders? And thinking about that from the perspective of, okay, well, if I was going to only work 2 days, what happens to the rest of my role in the 3 days? What happens if I want to start late and work late? And what happens to the calls that are going to come in between 9 and 11 a.m. if I'm not going to start between them? And really having, I guess, a prepared response for how you'll have that conversation with your leader, so that you're going into that conversation and it's more of a commercial discussion as opposed to a really emotive and emotionally charged discussion. When we look at how we support our employees as well, it's also thinking about how do they think about that rhythm that's going to work for their team? How do they think about the rhythm that's going to work for the business as well?
Great. And I think that is, as we said, a critical piece that a lot of organisations tend to miss. So let's move on to our last strategy. And what I'd like to talk a little bit about here, Penny, before I hand back to you, is we're finding with organisations that we're working with in this space that they're at this really pivotal point, right? Where they're now thinking about people are starting maybe to come back into the office, you know, in or maybe they've said, we want you to come back in 1 day a week, or maybe they're planning for 2021 in terms of how they transition back. And all types of questions are being asked in the HR teams that we work with around, are we just going to say to everyone, do what you want? We support flex, just kind of do what you want. Or are we going to say to people, you have to be in the office 25% of the time? Or are we going to say to people, you need to actually sit down with your leader and both of you need to agree on a flexible work arrangement? I feel like organisations are really at this point in time where they're needing to figure out what do they do? Which approach do they take? And what is going to be right for their organisation? So that kind of leads us into what I think is one of the most critical pieces here, and that's from an HR perspective.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more. And I think HR, you know, historically have really played this unique role where they've sort of straddled the OH&S, you know, legislative requirements. They want to also be supportive of HR, of flexibility, but they also then, you know, are hearing from the leaders and the employees of the organization, you know, it's working or it's not working. So HR are really in this really unique position. And I think for us, that final strategy is, what is the role that HR plays in future-proofing flexibility? And there's sort of 4 kind of buckets that I think, you know, organizations should really think about and consider. And the first one is to get your process right, you know, having that flex policy. And, you know, for many organizations, if they had one, it's probably updating that flex policy so that it is current, that it is relevant, that is reflective of the time and place that you are now working, that you've got, you know, the associated HR process that are going to marry up with that flex policy. How do people apply and you know, initiate a flex arrangement? How do they change the flex arrangement? Something as simple as, is the flex arrangement, once it's put in place, is it permanent? Or are you putting in a trial process? And by that, we mean, you know, try it out for 3 months. Have there be some review and touch points so that if it isn't working for both parties, if it isn't mutually beneficial, there is that opportunity for leaders and employees to have some empowerment over how they're working, to say, you know what, it's not working. Let's have a discussion for what we're going to do moving forward. And then obviously the work from home, the work health safety regulations that are needing to be supportive of your flex arrangements as well. There's obviously the education process. So we talked about this, looking at the leader, the people capability, really, you know, capitalizing on understanding and using this education process to be really clear on what's your organization's narrative on flex. Is it all roles are flex? Is it that we want people to be their best selves, that they get to choose where they get to work? Is it that, you know, flex is an individual choice and we need to be cognizant of how and when we work? Being really clear and using that education as the platform to really elevating your flex discussions. For me, communications is really, you know, being your own PR agency and being that PR drum in your internal organization to say, here are our guiding principles. Here's what we stand for. Here's what we will and won't do around flex. Having a really clear campaign that's not just a one-off thing that, you know, comes out once a year, that you're drip feeding so that you're continuously reminding people, here's how flex works in practice, and using people from all cross sections of the business at all levels of the business, so that it's not just always your senior execs that are up there talking. You know, we hear from those people all the time. Show people that are a little bit different so that we normalize flex, and really having people that are going to champion it as well. And then finally, that fourth piece is really building flex into that overall experience, that employee life cycle. How do we weave flex into all of those touch points, our employer brand, so that regardless of if you're internal or external to the business, you know what we live and stand for around flexibility, and that it becomes part of your overall business culture.
Great, thank you, Penny. I feel like we've got to the end of our strategies, and that's been a really comprehensive overview. I think that in all of these strategies, we've really covered all of those elements that people need to be thinking about. And so what we hope that's given, before we move on to the next slide, what we hope that has given the participants on today is an ability to really step back and think about what your organisation is doing well, and where potentially might some of the gaps exist. And so what we'd like to talk to you about next is obviously where we can support you in filling those gaps that your organisation might have in this space. Yeah. So if we go on to the next slide.
Perfect. Thanks, Vanessa. Brilliant. So as I'm going through this last slide, I'd love for you to pop in any final comments into the chat box, so that we can kind of round out the conversation that we're having on flex and future-proofing flex. And I guess before I sort of jump into, the ways that the Learning Circle can support you, I think it goes without saying that this year has just been such an absolute curveball for everybody. And, whilst you may have been starting the year thinking, yes, we have an absolutely robust process around flexibility, that may have shifted significantly as, it was really pressure tested throughout COVID. So I think the opportunity for all of us, regardless of where you sit, is to, perhaps look back on these 5 strategies and take one of them to focus on between now and the end of the year. And then think about, okay, 2021, what do we want flex to look like in our organization? Are we, looking at each of these strategies, are we doing it well, or are there opportunities for us to develop in? And in terms of how we can help, you've seen today, some of the strategies that we would help you deploy as an organization in terms of flexibility. So, around those diagnostics, when we look at the organizational macro view of flexibility, we can support with comms plans, we can support with the education and support resources for leaders and employees. We can also support in a more broader context in terms of D&I consulting. So it might not just be the flexibility piece that you want to look at, but it might be your broader D&I strategy. What are the streams that you want to focus on? How do you engage executives in that process? How do you develop, employee resource groups? How do you build out that strategy and execute that D&I strategy? And then, maybe you've got that D&I strategy in place, and it's around the education that you need some more support in. So workshops, seminars, both virtually and face-to-face, around topics like inclusive leadership, unconscious bias, supporting working parents as they transition out of the business and back into the business around parental leave, and also that late career transition as well. So we offer that whole spectrum of D&I initiatives and solutions.
Great, thank you, Penny. And before I hand back to Em, just to reinforce Penny's last words, we are here to help. So please feel free to get in touch with Penny and I in the future if you think that there is any pieces of this that we can support you in terms of flex in your organisations. And certainly from us, we hope that you've enjoyed the session today, but more importantly, that you feel like you've taken something away from it that's really of practical value for your organisation. Thanks, Em, as well, for inviting us on, and back to you.
Thank you. We do actually have just a couple of questions, if it's okay. We stick around for another 5 minutes. Right. Actually, more of a comment, because most contracts of employment actually nominate a location. So supporting an ongoing flex process and mitigate risk, an arrangement should have an agreement with definition. And as you all say, that's part of the conversation, obviously supports management of people and the way flex integrates, but comes back to that policy and and contracts, it's really important to have that foundation in place.
Yes. And I think it comes back to my point earlier that, you know, when we look at the flex process, it can't be developed in isolation. You know, flex is a piece that is, you know, broad organizational context that you need to engage with your employee relations so that you're tight in terms of the legislative requirements. That you're engaging from an operational perspective, those key operational leaders that are going to really operationalize flex and know from a day-to-day perspective what will and won't work, that you're engaging with your senior executives so that you've got that sponsorship and buy-in. So when we think about flex, yes, for you know, our HR practitioners or D&I practitioners can do the legwork, but it needs to be developed in consultation with the business.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one other thing, like, I think, you know, we're talking about 2021 and oh my gosh, there's just so much to think about. You got like even now engagement, and then moving into people coming back into the office and everything that comes with it, with that. I think, where do you draw the line if, you know, like, it's safe, everything's sort of going back to normal, and you say, okay, I want everybody in the office. Can you draw a line? And how, I think it'll be interesting to see how that affects engagement, because I'm already listening to a few people out there who have been forced to come back, well, not forced to come back, but strongly recommended, and they don't want to, they're not ready yet. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that affects engagement. But from your perspective, where do you think there is a line?
Penny, I was just going to say, I feel like that, and if I'm just going to be really honest and transparent, we don't have the answers to these. And I feel like a lot of organizations don't either. I think that is exactly what we are finding that our HR clients are struggling with now, because there is so much to balance, right? You know, what the organizational wants from that perspective, what an employee wants from a health and wellbeing perspective, how do we logistically manage people getting public transport in if people don't feel safe? How do we manage 3,000 people getting up in the lifts in those Barangaroo towers? I mean, I just feel like there are so many questions that are unanswered. You know, I don't know what we are certainly hearing from the organizations that we work with. So I can only answer this in kind of practical terms, is some of those organizations are mandating, we want people in X amount of days a week. Okay. But we haven't seen anyone mandate it for more than 2 days a week. So some are saying 1 day, some are saying 2 days. We've seen some organizations provide additional support for people that want to drive into the city and negotiating discounted rates with like Wilson and secure parking. That's what we're seeing at the moment. Other than that, most of our clients are still at home and haven't yet decided what they're going to do for next year.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how it pans out.
I haven't answered that properly, but I also wanted to be really honest in how I answer that.
Well, there's no definitive answer, is there? I think it'll be interesting to see how it pans out and the research that'll come from it.
Yeah, agree.
I think, you know, I think it is a bit of a wait and see. I think first and foremost, you know, the safety of employees has never been more critical for organisations. And I think in partnership with that it is the reputational damage. So if organisations were to have had a positive COVID case, you know, the reputational damage for some of these organisations, they cannot recover from it. So I think organisations as a whole are taking a very conservative approach to how they do this. But I guess if I was sitting on this webinar listening to this conversation, for me, it would be, you know, getting those stakeholders in the room regularly, the ones that are key decision makers. So your work health safety, your ER, your, you know, operational leaders, your executives, to make a really clear roadmap for your organisation for what you're going to do. Because whilst, yes, we may be seeing, you know, that immediate spike in engagement and productivity, I dare say that is dropping day on day as we really see the reality play out of working from home in a longer term period. And I think, you know, back in July when Melbourne went back into lockdown, I think that was a really clear sign for a number of organisations that, wow, this really hasn't gone away and we're not where we thought we would be in the last of the year. So, you know, for me, my recommendation would be to be having a plan, but being quite fluid with that plan, because I know that that plan is probably going to shift and change before we even end the year. But, you know, I think being really clear around, you know, and reading up on your research as an HR practitioner for, you know, what the research is saying around what culture and engagement is doing. And, you know, there needs to be a strong HR focal point to the table to say, you know what, there is going to be a point where we're going to need to have some really clear guidelines around what we expect from people in terms of coming to the office. And it may be how you position that, you know, when we're at home, we're doing, you know, focused work. And when we come to work and to the office, this is our opportunity to collaborate and to really you know, build culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, look, Vanessa, Penny, thank you very much. And everyone else, if you do need support with anything, don't be afraid to reach out. You can reach out to me, Emma Egan. You can reach out to Penny. You can reach out to Vanessa, because yeah, there's a lot of ambiguity around at the moment, but there are people that can support you through it. Thank you again, ladies from the Learning Circle.
You're welcome. Thank you, Em. Thank you, everyone.
Enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you, everybody, for joining.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.